If we think about opportunities to improve nutrition outcomes, we know that NCDs has now become the leading global cause of death worldwide, and that the risk factors for burden of disease in 2016 was more than 3/4 linked directly to the diets that we consume on a daily basis. And so it's no wonder that in the SDGs, there's in fact not only the 2 SDGs that we mostly focus on, namely zero hunger and good health. In fact, in each of the SDGs, there is an implicit nutrition outcome. And so what are the challenges and opportunities for us today? First of all, we have heard some talk already about quality versus quantity. And if you look at the slide to your left, that was what our National Food Consumption Survey said that most households were consuming in 1995. And you can see, indeed, that is a really bleak picture, talking about colors in the diet. And the diets of the poor in developing countries usually consist of these very high amounts of staple foods, mostly maize, wheat, and rice, but very few micronutrient-rich foods. And even though they transition within 1 decade to the picture just below, we can still see that although the picture looks colorful, there's not much micronutrients in it. As opposed to what is on your right, which is the food-based dietary guidelines that you can see really includes whole foods and lots of color. So in order to advance food qualities of diets, there is different strategies that have been used in nutrition. And the first one, and we've heard quite a lot about that, is supplementation. And as we heard yesterday, I mean, that was a short-term solution that was rolled out to help individual children or people at risk of anemia to overcome that disease. And but it has now become part of the multi-pronged long-term approach to alleviate micronutrient deficiencies. But we know, as we heard yesterday, that supplementation only reached maybe half the population in most countries. Then mandatory fortification of staple foods are one of the solutions that policymakers just throw at diets in order to make sure that the population at large is getting those nutrients. Now, after 15 years of a multi-mix fortification being used in our staple foods in South Africa, the only nutrient that has really been solved is folic acid. So what are we actually teaching to, in the longer term, to our populations in terms of diets? Are we teaching them actually to just eat more starch? Or are we trying to promote the diverse diets that in the longer term, and I mean already fortification for a program that's running longer than 15 years and cannot show the implicit benefits, make you wonder, is it really so expensive to teach people about diverse diets? So in most countries, the policies and practices followed are these fortifications, and then we have what we call zero rating of single agricultural food products to encourage people to actually consume more or dairy and particular fruits and vegetables. And then also country-specific food-based dietary guidelines was something that FAO has implemented to guide people into what is healthy food choices. But the argument is that in a lot of situations, diverse foods are unavailable because there's only 30 crops that supply 95% of the calories that people obtain from food. And of those 4 crops, maize, rice, wheat, and potatoes in that order supply over 60% of what we are consuming. And supply of ingredients, namely refined flour, sugar, soy, palm oil, and high fructose corn syrup, is now appearing over and over again in a huge range of different products. And what may appear like a variety on shelves in the retail sector is in many instances just the endless re-engineering, recombining and repackaging of the same basic, highly processed ingredients. And if we look at what is the cost of a healthy diet, we can see that a nutritious diet actually does cost a lot more. In Sri Lanka, they found that it's 38% more, Afghanistan is 15% more, and we actually calculated that in South Africa, more than 60% of the population is actually not able to afford on a daily basis a healthy diet. And that's true for most of sub-Saharan Africa. So what are the kind of policies that we should adopt at local level? So first of all, try to increase the nutritional value of those foods that are consumed. So micronutrient fortification does come as a solution. Also the biofortification of staple crops. But something that everyone has jumped onto the bandwagon is how to decrease less healthy ingredients by regulating and passing fiscal legislation in many countries in the past 10 years. And the problem is with many of these policies is that in fact that it is not put towards consumer education or to increase the availability of healthy foods. So for instance, the Trans Fat Act came into being in South Africa as, I think, as one of the very first countries. There's now more than 15 countries that has that legislation. We have sodium reduction regulation. More than 38 countries have that. But unless you have strong consumer education that goes with that, you will not be able to reach the targets because people discretionarily add salt at the table. And one of our foods that are regulated was wheat bread, which the industry very strongly tried to build a case that they cannot bake bread without with those low salt levels. But fortunately for food composition, we had data from the 80s where we knew that they baked at that stage bread with those low salt levels. And they are able to comply now. And then sugar tax, which is a fiscal tax in most countries on sugar-sweetened beverages, is mostly used to fill the purse of local governments and not actually to educate consumers on what they should be eating for better health outcomes. So, and one thing that policymakers can do is to reduce the cost and price volatility of nutritious diets by food subsidies, but we've heard during this conference that this also have a role on effect on when you are importing or exporting food products. So how do we address hidden hunger and the lack of nutrients? We know that 9 out of 10 countries face this double burden of malnutrition, and we've heard quite a lot of that. And so one of the policies and practices that are being used is the front of package food profiling methods, such as the robot system or the traffic light system or warning logos. And once again, the point was made, does this really change behavior of the uneducated person that has to do that has to rely on some cues when they are purchasing food? But one very clear science-based evidence is that if you limit promotion of unhealthy food choices to children, it does have positive outcomes. So homogeneity versus biodiversity, we know that only 4 varieties of apples are seen all over the world, although there's more than 7,000, and of the 1,000 banana varieties, we know that the Cavendish with a very low beta-carotene content is the one that is mostly consumed. And these kind of arguments is those that we should bring in as health professionals into the arguments of national governments in order to monitor and manage agricultural biodiversity at the national level, to guide country-specific policies and public investments in sustainable food systems, and also to promote these products at farmer and consumer groups, to guide best practices and influence policies and programs. And there are many huge actors that have invested lots and lots of funding and evidence-based to show that this can really make a difference. And then foodborne diseases is just to show that Africa and Southeast Asia are the areas mostly suffer from the global burden of foodborne diseases, and that is very important if you are doing an intervention program that you actually do deworm at the right time to be able to show the evidence. And we know that almost 1 in 10 people in the world fall ill after eating contaminated food, and that this is something that we as nutritionists tend to ignore to some extent, and always think it's somebody else's job to do that. And policymakers should foster this multi-sectorial collaboration amongst public health, animal health, agricultural and other sectors for better communication and for joint action. And going right down to food handlers and consumers on how to handle and prepare food safely. So we had a talk earlier today as well on climate change, and we know that food systems do not only contribute to the sustainability of the planet, but are also affected by the changing planet. And it will impact all sectors of the food system from production to consumption. And to some extent, we also heard that climate change is now stretching the conversation about quantity versus quality, because there will just be so much less food being able to be produced in certain areas. And it lowers the yield of the key staples. So what are the principles that can be applied to policies and practices? And principles such as nutrient recycling, biodiversity conservation, enhancing diversity within animal and plant production, the provision of favorable soil conditions for crop production, and the management practices to improve animal health comes to the forefront. And then there's major gaps still that we still need to further address. Food services and street vendors and stalls have mostly been ignored in most countries, as it's so very difficult to actually reach them effectively. Portion control via calorie labeling linked to pricing is something that we don't see in developing countries at all. Snacking throughout the day, the sheer availability of food in different environments, and then the rise of convenience foods. And also we can add the aging population, rapid urbanization, are all major gaps that need to be addressed. And with that, I want to thank you.